Sometimes, a movie I hate or just don't like, it happens to have one great scene in it, which works against all the odds. So here's a list commemorating those one great scenes in 5 movies I didn't like. Number 5. The Dead Kraken scene from At World's End. Pirates of the Caribbean At World's End was one of the first movies I saw in the cinema, which really disappointed me. I remember that feeling of just not liking this film at all, and then talking about it with my friend after we left the cinema. It was actually a big moment for me. But as the years have gone by, I can't help but come back to this small scene where Jack Sparrow and Barbossa come upon the corpse of the giant kraken. For Jack, this scene is catharsis. This is the monster which terrified every living sailor, and spoilers, it even devoured Jack in the second film. To see the kraken lying dead on the beach is inconceivable to Jack, and all his plans of trickery and deceit fall flat in the face of such carnage. And then Barbossa has a heart-to-heart with him on his foolish dreams of surviving and outrunning the world. And yes, this is kind of weird because Barbossa and Jack have been bickering back and forth like little kids in the rest of the movie. But this is the one time, probably the one time in the whole series of Pirates of the Caribbean, where I honestly believed these two men sailed together once. They used to work together until Barbossa had enough of Jack and betrayed him, which led to the first movie. Jack was so upset by that betrayal, he saved a bullet for Barbossa. Those kinds of emotions have to come from somewhere, and this tiny conversation finally alluded to some of that feeling. It added a new layer to their relationship, and it fascinated me. For the first time, I actually bought that these two had a friendship, or at least a working relationship, which Jack would care about having lost. Now obviously this scene is incredibly contrived, and it's hindered by the two comedic foils being unfunny. And the way they get to this scene makes very little sense, to be honest, but I don't care. I like Jack and Barbossa's interaction in this little scene with the dead kraken, and I like the ideas that it tried to convey. Number 4. The Battle of Passchendaele, from the movie Passchendaele. It's been quite a while since Passchendaele first came out, but man, I was so hyped for this movie. It was touted as the most expensive movie Canada had ever made at the time, and Paul Gross was talking all the time about how he based the movie on the stories he heard from his grandfather, and I was a sucker for Canadian films about Canadian accomplishments. So you can imagine my disappointment when this movie was a disaster. It has a rushed story, the characters are either unmemorable or broad caricatures, and I won't even go into the atrocious climax that this movie has. But in the midst of all that crap, the movie remembered that it was called Passchendaele. And for all the movie's flaws, the actual battle is portrayed really well. I remember watching the battle and being shocked at how good it was. All the horror of war was very authentic and very well shot. The battle scene looked incredible. It's like they were actually there. I was actually reminded a bit of Saving Private Ryan when I first saw it. And they even killed off one of the film's worst characters. Say what you will about Passchendaele, but for about 8 minutes, it suddenly provided everything we were promised in the movie's title. Unfortunately, there's the rest of the film you have to deal with to get there. Number 3. The skull scene from Django Unchained. I'm just going to get it out of the way. I really do think that Tarantino peaked with Pulp Fiction, and he's suffered from a case of overhype ever since. He's better at writing individual scenes than overall stories. He's not as much a film director as he is a film DJ. But all that aside, when he sits down to write a scene for his main villain, it usually becomes the best scene of the film. It's true of Inglourious Basterds, and it's certainly true of Django Unchained. In this scene, Schultz and Django are close to the end of their scheme to get Brunhilde out of Calvin Candy's grasp, but what they don't realize is that Candy has caught on to their plan. But before he arrests them or captures them, or really does anything, Candy decides to humiliate Django for thinking he could fool him. and it's a brilliant scene. Candy is already a very colorful character, but in this scene, he himself pretends that all is well as he lectures his new friends on the very fake study known as phrenology. Maybe he genuinely believes it, maybe he doesn't. But this horribly racist lecture infuriates Django, and that's exactly what Candy wants to do. I will never figure out how DiCaprio did not get an Oscar nomination for this role. Calvin Candy is hysterically immature, but he's also very threatening and dangerous. He's like a more self-aware King Joffrey. Add to it Tarantino's writing talents, and we're given a scene that reminds us just why Tarantino is so popular. Number 2. Obi-Wan visits the clones from Attack of the Clones. Of all the Star Wars movies that I've seen so far, Attack of the Clones is the very worst one. The other two movies had more than one moment that I still can't help but like, so they did not qualify for this list. But this one? Oh yes, there is only one scene that I would rewatch from Attack of the Clones, and it's this one. Obi-Wan arrives at the mysterious planet Kamino, where he finds a group of aliens who make their living by creating clones. The scene, like the whole movie, suffers from way too much CGI, but I don't mind it in this scene. The aliens have a cool design, and I really liked the voices they got. But here's the thing. This scene is almost entirely exposition, with Obi-Wan being told why the clones are being made, how the aliens managed to do it. You would think that all this exposition would be boring, but honestly, it's fascinating. The aliens view these clones not as individuals, but as scientific accomplishments. And on top of that, the clones are all based on a bounty hunter who's a notorious criminal. But the aliens don't care, they just pay him whatever he wants. I think that's just how alien they really are, no pun intended. They can't wrap their heads around the idea that the bounty hunter would want an unaltered, imperfect clone for himself, because the idea of desiring a son or a daughter, it's beyond their understanding. It also explains why they can view clones being bred to be soldiers as nothing but a scientific accomplishment. Morality and warfare mean nothing to them as long as they uphold their reputation and get paid. It's one of the most interesting portrayals of aliens that I've ever seen, and it came from the very worst of the Star Wars prequels. And number 1 goes to the airport security scene from Dogs of War. Anybody who has seen my review of John Irvin's The Dogs of War will know why I dislike the film. Except for this surprisingly amazing scene where the main character, played by Chris Walken, first arrives at the African country of Zangaro. He's subjected to airport security so corrupt that the officer almost forgets to collect his importation tax. For his part, the main character is traveling under an assumed name and is spying on Zangaro for an operation to take out their leader. And so he's forced to keep his cool while the security officer goes through his belongings and finances piece by piece, taking a cut of everything. Both the actors do a great job in this scene. This is one of my favorite Chris Walken moments just because of how Walken manages to put so much comic exasperation into a subdued and serious performance. The actor who plays the officer is just as good too. He's obviously skeptical of the false passport and the false identity, and as well as the ridiculous reason Chris Walken gives for visiting Zangaro, but rather than arrest Walken's character, he gleefully robs him and abuses his power. And it all caps off with the only line that such a scene could possibly end on. It's just brilliantly set up and brilliantly delivered. This is a scene done almost perfectly. The atmosphere is right, the performances are right, the camera is right, the editing is right, and the writing is hilarious in a way that makes you smile rather than laugh. If the rest of The Dogs of War was just as good as this scene, it would have been an amazing film. But as it is, we're given this one great scene in an otherwise mediocre at best film.